Heat wavered on the open road like a living thing, the noon sun pressing until the rocks seemed to breathe. George rode with his hat tugged low, leather creaking under him like an old memory. Dust curled off the trail in thin spirals, and the scent of sage lay warm and bitter on his tongue. He had followed a rumor through 2 towns and a silent arroyo, a rumor of a woman left at the edge of a burned-out place, a warning against mercy. The barn rose from the flats like a black rib cage. Fire had taken the roof and left the beams scorched, pointing at the pale sky. No birds sang. Even the grass kept still. George reined in and listened. Far off, a hawk stitched the horizon. Closer, a thin rasping broke the quiet. He dismounted and led the horse through a gap in the fence. The yard held the ash of old feed, a kettle on its side, a child's marble sunk in dust. Beside a charred post stood a figure in white, cloth torn gray with soot, a veil pulled low as if to hide from the day. Rope bit into thin wrists. Bare feet pressed the earth as if asking it for mercy. The world tipped, not with recognition yet, but with the ache of what people become when abandoned. He moved slowly, afraid to startle the silence. The veil quivered with each breath. He reached for the knot, and a voice came from behind the cloth, dry as mesquite bark. "Please kill me fast before they arrive." The words struck like a thrown stone. He did not answer. He found his knife and cut the rope with steady care, eyes on the horizon while the line fell away. When the cloth loosened she swayed, caught herself on the post, and turned her hidden face toward him, as if bracing for a blow she had long ago learned to expect. He said her time was not finished. They would not take her again. He spoke it as a fact the earth could stand on. He lifted the veil. Sun slid across a face he had carried like a faded sketch inside his heart. Dust along the cheekbones, a mouth split at one corner, yet the shape of her remained. The high left brow, the small silver scar near the ear. Something in him stumbled though his boots did not move. The name rose. Olden knew at once. Elizabeth. Her eyes were not the eyes of the girl he had loved. They were the eyes of a woman who had walked through rooms without doors, and learned to fold fear small enough to carry. She looked at him as if he were a mirage, and he felt the same, 2 ghosts meeting on the same patch of dry ground. "You should not be here." "Someone had to be here," he told her, working the knots at her ankles while flies droned, and the hawk made patient circles. Rope peeled away in stiff spirals. She tried to stand and the world tipped. He caught her weight with arms made steady by years of fence and cattle, and the quiet arithmetic of survival. Her head fell against his shoulder for one breath. Then she pulled away, a small animal choosing the corner over the hand. He stepped back. Set the canteen in her palms. Watched the first sip burn down her throat. Water cut a clean line through soot at the corner of her mouth. He remembered a different summer, a creek, her hem pinned as she waited, a dare in her smile. He closed that door and looked only at now. "How long?" he asked. She lifted a finger, then shook her head. Time had become a trick her captors played, a card up the sleeve. She said only soon. "They will come soon." He tore a strip from the veil and wrapped her wrists where the rope had opened the skin. Found no shoes, so he cut his saddle blanket in 2 and bound her feet. The horse tossed its head once, as if agreeing. He lifted her carefully, not like property kept for trade, but like a person told too often she was less than dust. As he swung into the saddle behind her, the land breathed again. A wind rose, carrying the faintest tremor from beyond the ridge. Hoofbeats. Light at first, then settling into a rhythm a man could measure with his blood. Elizabeth stiffened. Fear went through her like lightning through wire, quick and unseen until it burned at the posts. He asked where to, and she pointed with her chin. Not a town, but a cut in the hills where water gathered after rain. He turned the horse. They moved into the open with no cover but their courage and the stubborn trust of a good animal. The trail sloped toward a dry wash threaded with cottonwoods. Leaves made a sound like soft handclaps. Shadows stitched the ground into places to vanish. George kept to the shallowest lines, avoiding the deep where a man can be trapped by his own need for hiding. He felt her breath slow. He let his own heart choose a quieter drum. At the edge of the wash he slid down and led the horse, boots sinking in powder that remembered water. He brushed out their prints with a broken branch. Elizabeth watched with eyes that weighed more than distance. The boy she had known would have charged the horizon with a dare. This man moved like a prayer learned too late to speak aloud. They reached a place where the wash narrowed to a throat between two boulders. He led her through and paused in a slice of shade. She touched the stone as if it might answer. He saw her hands, not just wounds, but the stubborn grace of fingers that had held on through nights without music. "Tell me if there is pain you cannot bear," he said. She looked a long time, and something quieted, a small creature lifting its head to air after a cellar door opened. She said she could bear what she must until she reached a place where her name meant something again. "We will make that place," he said. The hoofbeats rolled closer. Dust lifted on the far plain like a veil shaken by an unseen hand. George led the horse along the wash until the land offered a deer path climbing toward a low ridge. The sky widened with each step. The sun leaned west, giving hard gold to the world. At the ridge the wind met them full. The road behind lay like a thin thread. Far back, a knot of riders moved with the mood of men who think the world belongs to them. George set one hand to the horse's neck, the other open at his side. He turned to Elizabeth. What remained of the veil hung from his belt like a strip of ghost white. She met his gaze and gave a single nod. The path ahead bent into country. He knew in country he did not. He chose it anyway. They stepped into the wind, leaving the riders to grow in the distance, and the day narrowing toward whatever waited at the next bend. They rode in silence, the kind that presses close and listens to every breath. The land shifted under them from bare rock to patches of wiry grass, the sky widening overhead like an old sheet pulled tight. Elizabeth sat in front of him, her back against his chest, the warmth of her body faint but steady. Each time the horse lurched, he felt the brittleness in her frame, as though she had been hollowed by years of hunger and too much waiting. The hoofbeats behind had faded, swallowed by distance or by the wind that chased them east. Still, George's eyes flicked to every rise and hollow. A man who's ridden in danger knows it can step out of the earth at any moment. By late afternoon they came to a dry creek bed, the walls crumbling into little avalanches of sand. At its far end sat a weather-beaten stage station, half the roof patched with tin, its porch sagging under the years. Smoke curled from a stovepipe, thin as a string. He turned the horse toward it, thinking of water and a place to rest that wasn't under the open sky. A woman stood in the doorway, broad-shouldered, with gray threaded through her braid. She didn't startle at the sight of them, only stepped aside to let them pass. Clara, he remembered, a widow who had run this station longer than most towns had been standing. Her eyes, the color of worn leather, took in the boundless details without prying questions. The cut of Elizabeth's wrists, the dust on George's boots, the way her head stayed lowered. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling faintly of flour and kerosene. Clara set down a basin, filled it from a rain barrel, and pressed a cloth into Elizabeth's hands. No words, just the quiet language of someone who had seen too much and learned where to place gentleness. George leaned his rifle against the wall and took the seat by the window, watching the sun spill through warped glass. He saw Elizabeth dip the cloth, wring it out, touch it to her face. The water ran brown at first, then clear. She caught him looking and lowered her gaze, as if modesty were the last defense she had left. Clara moved about with the steadiness of habit, bread sliced thick, coffee poured black into tin cups. She asked nothing of where they had come from, or why Elizabeth's dress looked like it had been through fire. Questions, George knew, were sometimes worse than wounds. A boy appeared from the back room, lanky and sunburned, with the awkwardness of 16. Samuel. He nodded at George, then busied himself at the stove. In the clatter of pans and the low crackle of wood, the station felt like a pocket of safety too small to trust. When the bread was set before them, Elizabeth hesitated. George nudged the plate closer, and only then did she take a piece, holding it like it might vanish. She ate in small bites, the corners of her mouth tightening each time she swallowed. He realized she wasn't tasting it, only obeying the body's demand. Outside, the wind changed. George caught the faint scent of horses and leather, carried from the west. He rose without thinking, crossed to the door and scanned the horizon. Nothing yet, but the light was thinning, and the shadows gave more cover to what hunted. Clara joined him, wiping her hands on her apron. She said the trails west were busy with the wrong kind of men these days. Best to move at first light, if moving was the plan. It is, he told her. That night they slept in shifts. Samuel took the first watch, sitting on the porch with his rifle propped between his knees. George lay on a pallet near the wall, Elizabeth resting on the cot across the room. Her breathing was uneven, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep, as though her body wasn't sure it was safe enough to sleep. In the dark, George's thoughts drifted to the years between. What roads she had been forced down, what doors she'd been locked behind. He had looked for her once, with all the fire a young man could muster, but when weeks turned to months and every lead soured into rumor, the search became a wound he learned to work around. Seeing her now felt like finding the wound open again, fresher than it had any right to be. Near midnight, the wind rattled the shutters. Samuel knocked softly on the frame, and George rose to take his place. Outside, the sky was a spill of stars, the air cooler against his skin. He could hear the low rush of Clara's stove fire, and the whisper of cottonwood leaves along the creek. Elizabeth stirred once, her eyes catching the starlight through the open door. She didn't speak, only watched him for a breath, then let her gaze fall away. That one glance said more than any words could. Trust still an arm's length away, but not as far as it had been. Dawn came pale and slow. Clara wrapped food in cloth, Samuel saddled the horse. Elizabeth moved carefully, each step deliberate. George noticed she carried her own weight a little more today, though she leaned on the porch rail before mounting. They rode east again, the land opening in long, rolling swells. The silence between them was different now, less like a wall, more like a field they might cross given time. By midday the heat lay on them heavy. Elizabeth shaded her eyes and pointed toward a low hill cut with an animal path. George guided the horse up, each step loosening stones that rolled away into the grass. From the top they could see far across the basin, a scatter of mesquite, a thin thread of water, and far to the west, a dark smudge that might have been dust or might have been riders. She shifted in the saddle, her body tightening. He felt it as sure as if it were his own. "They'll keep coming," she said. "Not forever," he told her. The wind caught her hair then, lifting it in strands that caught the sun. She didn't look back at the smudge. She kept her eyes on the east, where the land folded into the promise of distance. George followed her gaze, the road stretching like a question neither of them yet had the answer to. The homestead came into view as the sun dipped low, its light running gold over the weathered boards and the long grass beyond. The fence sagged in places, mended where it mattered, and the barn leaned slightly as if listening to the wind. George slowed the horse, letting the quiet of the land settle around them. Here, the air smelled of dust and old timber, a scent that had followed him through the years like a steady companion. Elizabeth's gaze moved slowly over the place, her eyes touching each detail. The porch rail polished smooth by hands, the single oak casting shade, the window panes warped by time. She did not speak, but something in her shoulders eased, as though the land itself whispered that no one here would drag her back. George dismounted and offered his hand. She took it, her palm light and cool in his. When her feet touched the ground, she swayed, catching herself with the edge of the saddle. He steadied her, then let go quickly, giving her the dignity of balance. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean, a wide table by the hearth, shelves lined with jars of beans and flour, the bed tucked against the far wall. He fetched water from the well, its rope groaning as the bucket rose. She drank deeply, each swallow steadying the color in her face. That first evening passed in near silence. George cooked beans with bacon ends, the smell filling the room. Elizabeth ate slowly, as though unsure when the next meal would come, her eyes drifting to the door whenever the wind shifted. Later, she sat by the small window, mending the torn hem of her dress with thread pulled from an old shirt. The lamplight caught in her hair, and George found himself watching the movement of her fingers, precise, unhurried, the kind of work a person does when they've learned to make something last. He tended to the fire, adding wood in measured pieces. The crackle filled the space between them. Words would have felt clumsy here. They had both learned to read the language of silence. In the days that followed, a rhythm began to form. Mornings, George saw to the stock while Elizabeth boiled coffee and swept the porch. She moved with care, as though relearning the weight of her own body, but she did not hide from the work. Her hands, though marked with rope scars, found purpose in the small tasks, rinsing beans, folding blankets, hanging the wash where the wind could take it. George did not press her with questions. He learned instead from what she did not say. When thunder rolled in the distance, she glanced toward the horizon with the stillness of someone used to bracing for more than weather. When the neighbor's dog barked, her shoulders tightened, only to ease when no footsteps followed. One afternoon, Clara arrived with a basket of fresh bread and a handful of dried apples. She stayed for coffee, her eyes moving between George and Elizabeth with quiet understanding. The older woman did not speak of the past, but her presence was a kind of witness, as if to say she had seen women return from dark roads before and knew the slow work of their mending. Samuel came too, offering to help mend the fence. Elizabeth watched him work from the porch, her hands wrapped around a cup. When he stumbled, catching himself on a post, a faint smile touched her mouth, the first George had seen since the veil had fallen away. That night, under a sky spilling with stars, George sat on the porch steps. Elizabeth joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. The air was cool, the sound of crickets folding over the land. She spoke then, not looking at him, telling pieces of her years away, not in a single stream, but in fragments that landed between stretches of quiet. She spoke of places where the air smelled of mold, of nights she counted the cracks in the walls to stay awake, of faces that blurred together into one shadow. She did not name them all, and he did not ask. His part was to listen, to give her words a place to rest that was not inside her. When her voice trailed off, he said only that she was here now, and that here was hers as long as she wanted it. She looked at him then, the lamplight from inside catching her eyes. Whatever she saw there seemed to steady her, though she said nothing more. In the following days, her steps grew surer. She began to tend the small garden behind the house, clearing weeds from the beans, tying up the young tomatoes. George watched from a distance, not wanting to crowd her. There was a certain grace in the way she knelt in the dirt, hands deep in the earth, as if planting roots of her own. They began sharing the evening meal at the porch table, where the air was cooler and the view reached far into the folds of the land. Conversation was still sparse, but the silences had softened, no longer edged with fear. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, she asked if he had ever stopped looking for her. He told her the truth, that he had stopped searching with his boots long ago, but never with his heart. Her gaze held his for a moment, then drifted to the line where the sky met the earth. The days slipped by, each one adding a small stitch to something neither of them named. Elizabeth began to hum while she worked, faint tunes that rose and faded like the wind in the grass. George, in turn, found himself watching the horizon less for danger and more for the color it took at dawn. But the land held its own memory, and danger was never far from its edge. One afternoon, a rider passed on the far ridge, too distant to make out, but close enough to feel in the bone. Elizabeth saw him too. Her hands froze on the wash line, and George felt the air tighten between them. That night, neither spoke of the rider, but both kept their ears tuned to the wind. The silence they had built was still there, but it felt different now, not empty, but braced, as if the ground beneath it might shift. When he banked the fire and set the cabin in shadow, George saw her at the window, looking out toward the west. Her profile was steady, her jaw set. She turned only when she felt his eyes, offering the faintest nod, one that told him she was ready for whatever might come. The days grew hotter, the light sharper, the air holding its breath between sunrise and dusk. George moved through his chores with an ear turned always toward the horizon. Elizabeth sensed it too. Her steps had a quiet swiftness now, and her eyes scanned the edges of the land as if expecting the past to ride out of the heat shimmer. One evening, Samuel came by with news carried on the road from town. Men had been asking after a woman, description close enough to scrape the skin. They rode hard, their horses lathered, and their voices rough with the certainty that she was theirs to reclaim. Samuel's words fell into the room like stones in water, sending ripples through the air. Elizabeth said nothing, but her hands folded together so tightly her knuckles whitened. George told Samuel to stay the night. The boy nodded, no trace of argument, understanding the kind of company danger requires. Clara arrived later, bringing bread and a jar of pickled beans, her expression steady, but her eyes measuring every shadow in the room. She did not waste breath on hope or fear. She only asked what needed doing. They began quietly preparing. George oiled the rifle and checked each cartridge. Samuel stacked wood near the porch, the sound dull against the hard air. Clara moved through the cabin, setting water to boil, fetching clean cloth, her hands sure and deliberate. Elizabeth surprised them all by taking the box of shells from the shelf and sitting at the table, her fingers nimble as she checked each one. The sight of her, calm and intent, tightened something in George's chest. When the sun dropped behind the ridge, the land took on that strange stillness that comes before a storm. They ate little, the meal more habit than appetite. Outside, the night settled in layers, first the faint cooling of the ground, then the dark stretch of sky filling with stars, then the hush that made every creak of the house sound louder than it should. It was near midnight when George heard them. Hoofbeats, slow but certain, approaching from the west. He stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled in his arms, and watched the line of dust moving closer. Elizabeth came to the doorway, shawl wrapped tight, her face unreadable in the dim. The riders stopped at the fence line, 4 of them, shadows cut against the starlit field. One called out, voice dripping with the arrogance of a man used to taking. He claimed they had business, that the woman inside belonged to them. George answered with the kind of still voice that carries further than a shout. No one here belonged to anyone. The man laughed, the sound low and ugly, and the others shifted in their saddles. For a moment, the night hung between two choices. Then the leader dismounted, boots crunching over the dry grass. The others followed. George stepped down from the porch, closing the distance by deliberate paces. Samuel stayed in the shadows, rifle ready. Clara moved silently to stand behind Elizabeth, a hand light on her arm. The first man came within a dozen steps before stopping. His eyes were mean, his grin sharp. He said they'd been paid to bring her back, that she was worth more than anything George could offer. George told him value was not a thing men like them could measure. The man's hand drifted toward his belt, fingers brushing the worn handle of his pistol. George didn't raise the rifle yet. He watched, waited, let the silence stretch until the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Behind him, he heard Elizabeth's voice, steady, quiet, telling them she would not go. Not now, not ever. The leader sneered, calling her by a name that no longer fit her. She did not flinch. George lifted the rifle then, the barrel a clean line between them. His voice was calm when he said they'd best leave while the night was still theirs. It might have gone to shooting if not for the wind. It came sudden from the east, carrying dust that stung the eyes, swirling through the field. The horses snorted and sidestepped. The men cursed, pulling their hats low. George held his ground, the wind tugging at his shirt, his finger light but ready on the trigger. The leader stared at him for a long beat, then spat into the dust. He turned without a word, swung into the saddle, and jerked the reins. The others followed, their shapes fading into the dark until only the sound of hooves remained, growing fainter with each passing second. When they were gone, the wind eased, leaving the night heavy and still again. George lowered the rifle, but did not set it aside. Samuel stepped out from the shadows, eyes bright with the rush of what had nearly been. Clara let out a slow breath and moved back toward the hearth. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, the lamplight behind her turning her hair to a muted gold. She met George's eyes, and in the quiet that followed, there was no triumph, only the shared knowledge that this was not an ending, just a holding of ground for another day. They closed the door and barred it. George took the first watch by the window, the rifle across his knees. Elizabeth sat at the table, the shawl still around her shoulders, her gaze on the faint line where light met dark beyond the glass. Neither spoke, but the air between them was different now. Something had shifted, a thread drawn tighter, binding them to what must come next. Morning broke soft, the light spilling over the hills in slow ribbons, touching the land with a warmth the night had withheld. The air carried the scent of wet earth from a faint shower far off, though no rain had fallen here. George stepped out onto the porch, boots quiet on the worn boards, scanning the horizon as he had done every day since bringing Elizabeth home. No riders. No dust rising. Just the long, open sweep of prairie that held its secrets close. Inside, the kettle sang low on the stove. Elizabeth was at the table, her hair unbound, mending a shirt of his with the small, neat stitches she favored. The lines of strain in her face were softer today, as though the dark of the night before had given way to something lighter. When he came in, she looked up briefly, then returned to her work, the corners of her mouth easing into the faintest curve. They shared coffee and bread in quiet. There was no need to name the relief between them. It was in the way she poured his cup before her own, in the way he set another log on the fire without her asking. Outside, Samuel was tending the fence he'd promised to fix, his whistle drifting in through the open door. Clara would arrive later with supplies and, more than that, her steady presence. By midday, the cabin felt less like a place bracing for siege, and more like a home catching its breath. Elizabeth stood at the garden, trimming away the dead leaves from the young beans. George came to her side, holding a pail of water. She took it with a small nod, and together they moved down the row in companionable silence, their shadows long in the climbing sun. When the chores were done, they sat on the porch, the land stretching out before them in waves of green and gold. Elizabeth spoke first, her voice even, though each word carried weight. She said she could not live waiting for the sound of hoofbeats, that she wanted to lay down the life she had been forced to carry, and take up the one she chose. She looked out at the fields as she spoke, as if seeing in them the proof that such a life could exist. George listened, his hands resting on his knees. He had never been a man for speeches, but he had learned the worth of speaking when it mattered. He told her he wanted the same, that he wanted her not as someone to be guarded, but as the other half of the work and the days. His voice was steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. because what he was asking was not for the moment, but for all the moments that would follow. Her hand moved to rest on his, light at first, then with more surety. She did not answer immediately. The wind stirred the grass, carrying the faint sound of Samuel hammering in the distance. Finally, she said she would stay, if he would have her as she was, scarred, changed, but unbroken. He turned his hand to hold hers, the gesture sealing what words could not. Then, with a rare and almost shy smile, he said they should make it known proper. Her brow lifted, and he told her of the small clapboard church on the hill, its bell still sound enough to mark a promise. 2 days later, under a sky brushed with pale clouds, they rode to that church. Clara was there, her hair pinned neat, Samuel in his best shirt. The preacher, a thin man with a voice like worn velvet, stood ready. Elizabeth wore a dress Clara had helped alter, cream cotton, simple but soft, the hem falling just right. There was no veil. She had no need to hide her face again. The ceremony was brief, the words plain but strong. When George took her hand, it was not as a rescuer, but as a man joining his life to another's with clear eyes. Her vows were spoken without tremor, each word an act of reclaiming. The preacher blessed them, and the small gathering stepped outside into the sun. They rode back together, the land bright around them, the air holding that rare kind of stillness that feels like a beginning. At the cabin, Samuel went to tend the stock. Clara busied herself with the supper she had insisted on preparing. George and Elizabeth stood a moment on the porch, the quiet wrapping around them like a promise. Inside, she set her shawl on the chair, moving with the ease of someone no longer measuring each step for escape. He watched her, seeing not the girl he had lost, but the woman who had come back, stronger in ways that could not be taken. That evening, they sat side by side, watching the sun lay its last light over the fields. He felt her hand slip into his, warm and steady, and he knew they had crossed the threshold from survival into something far richer. Beyond the hills, the world was still wide and uncertain. But here, in this small piece of it, they had carved out a place that was theirs, not given, not taken, but made. And as the first stars broke through the darkening sky, the old truth settled between them, unspoken yet understood. Sometimes the truest rescue is not in the pulling away from danger, but in the quiet choosing to stay when the danger has passed. Before you ride on, tell me, where in this wide old world are you listening from? If this story of steadfast hearts touched you, share it, speak of it, let it travel as far as the horizon. There are more nights by the fire yet to come, and more tales worth the telling.